Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Community Supported Agriculture Twilight question and answer session. We're glad you joined us tonight, and we're in a rather strange and unprecedented time, and everything is not business as usual. So we wanted to talk through some of that from the CSA perspective. My name's Annette Wozlacki. I'm a professor in the Department of Plant Sciences at UT, and I'm also the Vegetable Extension Specialist and also work with produce safety. And we have several other specialists joining us tonight from UT, from the Center for Profitable Agriculture, as well as from the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics, and from food science as well. And we also have several people from the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. So thanks for all of our specialists and Department of Agriculture folks for joining us. And tonight we're going to be talking about different things related to community supported agriculture. So Megan, could you kick us off with a question?
Yes. Sorry about that. I have to find the right. So our first question is, I'm curious about best practices for keeping both members and employees safe, and if or how normal produce safety measures will be affected.
All right. So Samantha, could you go to our second slide, please? This one has to do with worker health more than anything else. And it's really important that you talk to your workers about the symptoms of COVID-19, which we've all seen out there many, many times now. And it seems like they're adding new symptoms by the day. But make sure that anyone who is feeling sick or who has a fever is staying at home. And now the CDC recommends that you do monitor your employee health. So when people come to work each day, you want to ask them how they're feeling. Some people take temperatures, and just make sure that you're keeping on top of that. So that's one way to make sure that your employees know that you want them to tell them when you want them to tell you when they're not feeling well, and then they're not going to be penalized for it. And that leads us into the next slide, and Margarita is going to talk a little bit about that for us.
All right. So as Annette was mentioning, one of the key things for your employees to report that they feel sick, and to have an incentive to report that they are not going to show up at work because they feel sick, is to know that they are protected by the law, and that they will have access to sick leave. So that when the Family First Coronavirus Response Act comes into play. It is important to know that if you have less than 500 employees, this will apply to you. And how are you going to count those employees? You're not going to count FTEs, but you are actually going to count all your employees, including part-time and full-time employees. So by law, following the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, any business with less than 500 employees will have to give a 2-week paid sick leave of up to 80 hours. In order to calculate that, if you're paying on an hourly rate, well, that's fairly easy to calculate. But if you're paying by the piece or a different way, there are tools in the Department of Labor that will allow you, and the IRS that will allow you to understand how to better calculate that paid sick leave. So there are 2 provisions under the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, which is one is related to a paid sick leave that is due to any employee that is in quarantine because he is experiencing symptoms of COVID-19, or because he needs to be self-quarantined because of any underlying conditions that make him more vulnerable. So again, that paid sick leave will apply to any employee. It doesn't matter if it's part-time or full-time. The second provision has to do with the fact that they have to be out of work because they are unable to work, because they have to take care of an individual that is subject to quarantine, or they do have to care for a child whose school or child care provider is closed or unavailable for reasons related to COVID-19. In that case, you have to pay 2/3 of that paid, and that's up to 12 weeks. Now, it's important to say that, can you go to the next slide, Samantha? Thank you. It is important to say that that second provision that has to do with having to take care of an individual that is quarantined or a child, small businesses have can be exempt, but there are few conditions that need to apply all at the same time for an employer to be exempt. So the first one is they have to have less than 50 employees that may qualify for the exemption. So less than 50 employees. That is again related due to school closing or childcare unavailability that they cannot show up at work. And the third condition is that the employer has to prove that letting go that employer or not having that employee in the place of work will jeopardize the viability of the business. So if those three conditions are met, then there is an exemption. It is important for you to know that all this information needs to be available to all employees. And here on bullet number 3, you have a link of where to get a poster that you can put in a place that is visible to all employees with this information. Now, of course, you might be wondering, well, I'm a very small business, and then that means that I have to give this paid leave to any part-time or full-time employee. You also need to know that you're going to be reimbursed by the IRS. So on the almost last bullet point, there is a link with information on how can you get reimbursed for this 2-week paid leave and this 12-week 2/3 of pay from the second provision. The last thing I'm going to say there is that the employees do not have to provide a written notice from the health provider showing that they had to be quarantined. But you could ask them what's the name of the health provider who recommended for them to be quarantined. This provision, the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, is effective it started being effective on April 1st, and this Response Act is gonna continue until December 31st of this year. That's it, Annette.
All right, thanks, Margarita. So I should have mentioned at the beginning, it's past my bedtime somewhat, and I wasn't thinking clearly. If anybody has a question, we're here to answer any questions you might have, and that's our main objective tonight. So if you have a question, you can go down to the chat box at the bottom of your screen where it says chat, and you can just type it in there. And we're happy to answer any of questions, and we really want you to get the most out of this that you can. So please use that chat box, and if you have that question, another grower probably has it as well. So Samantha, could you go to slide 6, please? So we're still talking for now about employee safety, and one of the things is masks. And we're hearing a lot about masks, and the CDC recommended that folks wear masks if they're out in public. And in a CSA situation, you know the number of people that are on your farm and how big your farm is, and if people can really get out and be in their own space. And in the field, this probably isn't going to be an issue at all. And wearing a mask, especially in Tennessee, as the weather starts to warm up more and more, is probably going to be pretty uncomfortable out in the open, and really not necessary if we're really spaced out in the field. In your packing house, again, you know the size of your packing house and if people are going to be elbow to elbow in there, or if there's plenty of room for them to space out. So I would say in both the field and the packing house, it would be optional if people wear masks. Of course, if an employee wants to wear a mask, that's their choice, and that's great, but it shouldn't be something that's mandatory unless you know that you can't provide that social distancing in your packing house. However, whoever's doing your CSA drop-off, the employee that's handling that for your operation, they should definitely be wearing a mask because they're the one that's going to be dealing with all of your customers. So that's a situation where we want to make sure that they definitely are wearing a mask. On the next slide, it's another topic we get often about wearing gloves. And generally for harvesting, we don't recommend wearing gloves, disposable gloves, unless that's a practice you're already doing on your farm. And most produce operations, that's not a common practice. And so oftentimes when we try to put gloves into a situation that we're not used to using them, we can end up it being not the intended effect that we want. So we do have a slide in here on gloves, and again, for people that are going to be interacting with your customers, that's a good time for a worker to wear gloves, so those customers know that you're taking this seriously and you're putting every precaution in there. But the other thing about gloves is all the information that we're seeing is this is mainly a airborne thing that we get, and that's why the masks can be important. But if you do have gloves that people are going to be using on your farm, you want to make sure that they know how to use them properly. And we want to make sure that they're not a replacement for hand washing, because that's not really going to be a replacement. So they need to wash their hands before they put on their gloves, and then they also need to wash them after they remove the gloves. And they really want to minimize contact with the gloves before they're wearing them. So they should take them right out of the box and put them right on. Oftentimes we take a pair of gloves thinking we might need them and stick them in our back pocket and go off and do what we're doing and then decide to put them on later. And we really don't want them to be exposed before we're putting them on. So just get them out of the box right when we're going to use them. If people are going to use them, we want to make sure that they're changing them regularly whenever they're changing tasks, or a minimum of every 2 to 4 hours, depending on what they're doing. And as it says here, improper gloves can be worse than dirty hands. So of course we don't want to wear the same pair all day. We don't want to keep wearing them if they get torn, and we do not want to reuse single-use gloves. And then the removal of gloves is also really important. So we want to make sure that we're peeling them off from the inside out, so we're not going to contaminate our hands with whatever's on the outside of that glove. So once we take that first glove off, we want to make sure we're peeling the second one off and not touching our bare hand onto the other hand that still has the glove on it. All right. So I talked about hand washing before we put on gloves, and that is really one of the best defenses for COVID-19. So Samantha, if you could skip to slide 10 for me, please. And we talk about hand washing in food safety, and the question asked about how will this fit into normal food safety practices. And this is really a great year to reinforce everything we talk about in our food safety trainings, because we talk about hand washing, but now it is extremely important and everybody is on high alert about hand washing. And I like this sign. This is from the Florida Department of Health, but it goes through the steps of hand washing, and this would be a great one to print and have right there where your workers are washing their hands. And it goes through the steps pictorially and also with the words. So first we're going to wet our hands, we're going to apply the soap, rub your soapy hands for 20 seconds, and it gets into the scrubbing your fingertips and between your fingers, which is also important, scrubbing your forearm to just about the elbow, and then rinsing everything. And then this is the part that I think people often don't do, and that's why I like this slide. So you dry your hands off on your forearms with a single-use towel, and then we're going to make sure that we turn off the water with that towel that we just used, so we're not recontaminating our hands because we turned that faucet on when our hands were dirty. And so that's a really good reminder for folks to see that proper way to wash your hands and to turn off the faucet. So you can print that. We have that on the utvegetable.com website, and we have the link to that at the end of this presentation that we'll show you. But that's a great one to have right there to remind your workers on a daily basis how to wash their hands. So the next part of it on the next slide is when we wash our hands. And the answer to that is pretty much whenever we're changing what we're doing before we start work. We already talked about the gloves, so before putting on your gloves and after removing them. Of course, after using the restroom, after breaks, after touching animals, now after you touch your face or blow your nose or cough or sneeze. And the one at the bottom, I think, is a good one that I hadn't really thought about too much before, but before entering your cooler or packing house. So we often don't go and wash hands right before we get into that cooler, and that's a really good one to think about. And oftentimes we might not have hand washing facilities already available. Samantha, can you go to the next slide, please? And that is really critically important this year to have those facilities available for your workers and available for anybody coming onto your farm. And hand washing facilities don't have to be complicated. That one there in the top left corner is one that you can make for about $20. And it's just using some 2x4s and a container there that you can buy at a big box store that's used for holding water or other liquids. And the nice thing about that container, which you can't really tell from this picture, is it has a spigot that remains on once you turn it on. So oftentimes we see ones that you have to push the button to keep the water coming out. And the problem with that is you're going to be washing one hand and then you have to switch hands to get the other hand clean. And now you're touching what you just touched with your dirty hand with your clean hand. So it's that cross-contamination effect of not really getting your hands clean. And so here that stays on and you can wash your hands well. The other important parts of this is you can see the bottle of soap there next to the blue container. And then in that bin underneath is where they keep their single-use paper towels. And then they have that bucket there. And that's really important to have that 5-gallon bucket or whatever kind of bucket you're going to use to catch that water that's coming off your dirty hands. Because we don't want to just let that go in the field and then we're stepping in it and then we're taking that back into the field, whatever's in that water and gets on the bottom of our feet. And then have a trash container for that single-use paper towel. Other options, you can rent them from companies that do porta-johns, and that's a fairly good option. When I called a couple weeks ago, the one here in Knoxville that I called was out of their hand washing stations, so they might be hard to come by in a year like this, but that can be a good option because just like with the porta potty, the company that you're renting it from will come out and service it once a week. So they'll replace the water in it, the soap, and the towels. And so it's one less thing you have to worry about if you're going that direction. And then the one there at the bottom can hook into a hose, and it has the drain at the bottom that, again, you can put a container there to catch the water coming through. But that's another one that you could buy at a box store. It has a nice table that goes along with it. So lots of good options there. All right, so that covered employee health. The other thing that we would want to cover as far as employee health goes is the cleaning and disinfecting and sanitizing. So Samantha, if you can go back to slide 8. Thank you. So we always talk about this in food safety. We talk about cleaning and sanitizing, and they are two different things, and you cannot sanitize, or in this case, disinfect a dirty surface. So we always want to make sure that we clean it thoroughly first. And cleaning is going to have 4 different steps, and that's going to be getting the major debris off, visible debris that you can see. And then you're going to want to scrub that surface with a detergent. And something like Dawn dish soap is perfectly fine for that. And then you're going to make sure you rinse that surface thoroughly. And then getting into the difference between disinfecting and sanitizing. Sanitizing is what we do for food contact surfaces. And sanitizers are going to be at a lower concentration, and they need to be in contact with that surface for a shorter amount of time than a disinfectant. So disinfectants are going to be higher concentration and going to need to be touching the non-food surfaces and any high touch surfaces for a longer amount of time. So this is where we want to disinfect tools that might be used by multiple people, and any high touch surfaces that your employees will come in contact with, as well as your customers if they come out to your farm to pick up their CSA shares. So this would be things like doorknobs, countertops, things like that. And with anything we use, we want to make sure that we always follow the label, because the label's the law. The easiest disinfectant for people to get a hold of and use is regular household bleach. So it's going to be 5.25% bleach. And the CDC recommends that you use 5 tablespoons of bleach in a gallon of water. And it's important, if you're using that, to make sure it's in a non-see-through container, because light can break down the active ingredient in the bleach, and we want to make sure that we have the potency to do that disinfecting that we want to do. So keep it out of the light, and we want to make sure that if it is exposed to light, that we're remixing it every 24 hours to make sure that we're getting that disinfection power that we want to. Next slide, please. So what are we going to clean and disinfect? We're going to disinfect things like our hose and harvest knives and harvest buckets and other commonly touched tools. They should be cleaned and sanitized as necessary. This is going to vary depending on how many workers you have on your farm and how many people are touching these things. So if one person has their harvest knife for the whole day, you can disinfect that at night or at the end of the day, the end of the shift, so it's ready in the morning. Better yet, if you can have designated tools for each worker, then you know there's nobody that touched somebody's knife, because you have 5 knives that look the same and, oh, I thought that was my knife, but I picked it up. And so if you can designate people's tools and write their names on them or some such, that really takes a lot of the guesswork out of that and makes it even less risky there. Any other commonly used items or areas of high touch points? So we already talked about doorknobs. Refrigerator handles are another good one. If everybody's getting in and out of the cooler or the refrigerator, that's a place that you want to make sure that you're definitely cleaning and disinfecting regularly. All right. Now, we talked about employee safety. If we're talking about our customer safety, if we could flip to slide 14, that one gets into some of the things we want to think about for our pickup for our CSA. And this is information that came from the Community Alliance with Family Farmers that has a really good publication about CSA pickups. And generally for our CSA, we run a 60-member CSA at the UT Organic Farm that's part of an organic internship program. And we generally give people 2 wax boxes a year, and they take their box one week, we write their name on it, we ask them to bring that box back the next week, and then we hand them their new box that's full of produce. And so we have a system where we rotate between 2 different boxes. However, that way we're reducing the risk, because we're not giving different members somebody else's box from week to week, and we know that whatever that person did with their box, they're getting their box back and it's not going to anyone else. In a year like this, we're changing that up, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But if you do not label boxes with customer names already, don't start it this year, because if you have a stack of boxes and people go and pick up their own boxes, depending on what your pickup site is like, then people have to touch more boxes to get to theirs if they're stacked up or something like that. Another way to handle that is to have an employee there that hands each customer their box, so they're the only person touching the boxes. You want to make sure that you're displaying boxes off the ground and in as short of stacks as possible that you can. And you want to remove any unnecessary items from your pickup site. So if you have a place where people just come and sign their name that they're picking up their box and check themselves off, something like a pen that they use, you want to get rid of that so everybody's not touching a communal pen to sign their share in and out. If you have a door that needs to be open to get to your pickup site, see if that door can be left open, or you want to make sure that you have someone that's sanitizing and disinfecting or disinfecting that handle frequently. We already talked about in the worker section that whoever is handling your pickup should wear a mask and gloves. Lastly, if you have a free choice option, so often with CSAs we'll have a couple of different types of produce, and members have a choice when they get there. Do you want beets or do you want more carrots? In a year like this, we want to think about foregoing that free choice option so people aren't handling the produce and everything's just packed and ready to go for them. Next slide, please. The other really important thing this year, more than any other year, is communicate with members before each pickup what your rules are for your farm and what the pickup's going to look like this year, because it is going to look a little different. So first of all, just like with employees, you do not want your customers coming to pick up their CSA if they're sick. You don't want them coming to your site. The other thing, and what we're going to do with our CSA this year, is do a drive-through pickup. So normally we have a spot in the UT Gardens where our members come and they come up to the van and we give them their box from there. This year we don't want them to get out of their car. One of our interns is going to put the box directly in their back seat or their trunk, and the member's just going to stay in their car and drive right through. So this will encourage them not to linger, and we'll make sure that we get them in and out safely and quickly. The other one is only touch your box and your food. So again, if you have multiple boxes sitting there and people come and grab their own box, we want to make sure they're not touching anybody else's food. I would encourage, again, having an employee there so they're the one touching the boxes and no one else. Another good consideration is think about reserving that first hour of your pickup for your higher risk members. So those people can self-identify and come during that first hour. So if they are in a situation where they're not just driving through, they're not commingling with a lot of people. Another good one is if you split that CSA box with other people, you want to make sure that one person is coming and picking up the box only, and then they leave the pickup site and they're dividing the box elsewhere. So you don't have people standing around dividing up their box right there. Another one is take your food and leave promptly. And this is a hard one because oftentimes people are coming out to the farm, and that's part of the CSA experience, is coming out and getting to talk to you and also getting a little bit of that farm experience. But this year we want to take that food and leave right away. If you do have multiple people coming to the pickup site at once, you want to make sure you have 6-foot markers on the ground at your pickup site so you can make sure that you're maintaining that physical distancing. Another one that you want to consider, again, if folks are coming all at once, is have your customers wear a cloth mask when they come to pick up their CSA at your site. And if possible, have only one person come to that pickup site and no kids. Another option is that you can stagger your pickup time so you know how many people are going to be coming within a 1-hour time slot. And another option is to offer delivery this year for an upcharge, so you can take people their food directly. And this is a really good option, again, if people are in higher risk categories. So I mentioned we would talk about the boxes. So if you can go back to slide 13. We do not want to reuse any cardboard boxes this year. And what we're going to use in our CSA is recycled grocery bag. And this way, each week we can put their vegetables, fruits and vegetables in that bag, and they are going to take it, and we don't want it back. We want them to use it, recycle it, whatever they're going to do with it at home. So anytime you're bringing a container back onto your farm, that could put your workers at risk. And I know several folks that have plastic containers that they use, and while those are sanitizable, it is another risk to bring that back in your farm this year, and an added amount of work to make sure that they're getting cleaned and sanitized properly. So it's a good idea also in your communication with folks to make sure that you instruct them that you do not want any containers back this year. So that's going to include not only the bag or box that you put their food in, but any other containers that you have within that bag or box. So berry boxes are a good example. We're only going to use those once this year, and then we don't want them coming back to the farm. Are there any other questions that have come up while you've been listening to this? Anything I didn't cover? It's a quiet bunch tonight. I think those are the main points we wanted to hit that are related to COVID-19. Are there any other things that people have questions about around CSAs? Anything our growers are doing differently that we didn't mention that they might want to share with other growers?
Annette, let me ask if you guys are familiar with Zoom, if you can raise your hand or Zoom, or you can use the chat box for us to see or to know how many of you are already doing a CSA. And how many of you, so first, if you can raise your hand or type in the chat box, how many of you are already doing a CSA? Let me change that question. How many of you are not doing a CSA and are considering starting one? Okay, so we have one in the beginning stages. Great. So you're fairly new to CSAs. Anybody else? Another one, again, CSA begins. So they are trying it this year. It seems like they're starting to use it. Isaac and John, do you have any questions related to general questions about CSAs? Since you are new to CSAs, do you have any specific questions related to pricing, logistics, how to keep your customers going? Any specific questions that are not related to COVID-19, but you might have questions about? Okay, so somebody's doing it for the past 2 years. Okay, thank you, Isaac.
All right. John's gathering information at this point.
Do you have any questions, specific question, Jones? Would you like to know about how to price your CSA share? Is that something that is appealing to you?
We have a yes from Isaac.
Yes, all right. So Samantha, if you can go to slides 18 and 19. 18 first. All right. So in order to determine your CSA share price or share box price, you probably already know that you need to consider what consumers are willing to pay for the box of fresh produce. You can obtain that information by looking at what other CSAs in your area are charging for a CSA share. And I'm gonna provide you a summary of that information for Middle and East Tennessee. You need to establish a base price for your products, and I'm going to show you in the next slide an example on how to do that. And that base price could be determined by looking at current grocery store prices and then determine a potential premium over that base price based on the quality of the products you are offering. You're offering delivery services, production system. If you're using an organic production system, you need to consider all those elements when setting your price premiums. Once you establish that price premium and estimate the potential prices for your CSA share, you need to make sure that those final prices are exceeding not only your production and marketing costs, but that those prices are covering for a fair wage for you and your family. We tend to forget that we are putting time on not only producing these vegetables, but also putting them in these boxes. In the table on the top of this slide, I summarized price information I found for 14 CSAs here in Tennessee that are currently active in Middle and East in the East Tennessee area. Keep in mind that these prices are for CSAs serving metropolitan areas such as Nashville and Knoxville. And we know that those customers that are going to be in those metropolitan areas are customers that are in a position or are willing to pay higher prices for fresh produce. As you can see in this table, the average CSA box price based on this sample of 14 CSAs is $28. So that's the average price for a box share or for a share box. The minimum price that I found was $24 per share box, and a maximum, which I was very surprised of, and this was in Nashville, $40 per share box. This is equivalent if you are providing a share for 20 weeks, which means that you're gonna be delivering these boxes 20 weeks out of the year. That's equivalent of, for the minimum price of $24 per share box, that's equivalent to $480. And for that guy that is doing a great job marketing his CSA at $40 per share box, that it's equivalent to $800 for a 20-week share. Okay, so you might be wondering, okay, so on average, how many items do I have in those share boxes? For the CSAs I collected information on, we have anywhere between 6 to 12 items, okay? So that's basically what we have. And then you might be wondering, do all of them look the same? Not necessarily. So there are some that are breaking the season into spring, summer, and fall shares. So they don't have the regular 20 week, but they will break it into 4 and 8 week shares. There are some offering, of course, those half shares, which basically what they are doing is that they are allowing the customer not to pick up a share every single week, but every other week. Anyway, the CSA models vary greatly for these prices. They offer the traditional CSA share, which is you basically, the customer pick up a share box every week for 20 weeks. There are other ones that are offering the market style CSA, which is where you set the products as if you were in a farmer's market and you allow the customers to pick a certain amount of each product of what is offered that day. I will probably not recommend that market style type of CSA right now, because that's basically allowing the customers to get too close to each other. So that might not be a good option. Of course, the most innovative models and there's one here in East Tennessee, that they allow the customers to select whatever they want in their share every week, and they pay online. So there is not an upfront payment, which offers more flexibility, but it's going to add logistics to the way you need to handle things. Samantha, can you go to the next slide? So I gather information basically today. So I collected information from 3 grocery store prices, and this is an example of how a CSA share box will look like in July for a specific CSA in Nashville. So you had carrots, a head of lettuce, cucumbers, sweet onions, a green sponge, tomatoes, garlic, eggplant, okay? So I look at prices as of today of 3 grocery stores, and I gather the price for conventional products and for organic products, just to estimate what will be the base price of a CSA if a customer were purchasing those products from a grocery store. As you can see, for the conventional prices, the value of that share box based on grocery store prices is going to be $15.86, which for a 20-week share, that will be around $320 or $317. If I use the organic prices, that's going to be equivalent to $400 per share. That is my base price, okay? So then I need to figure out what will be the premium that I'm going to put or I'm going to add to that base price. So just to give you an idea, this CSA in Nashville is selling this box for $26, which means that this farm is adding a 30% premium over the organic, if this was an organic box, or a 70% premium over the conventional base price, okay? So that's an exercise, that's a really nice exercise for you to figure out how much you should be charging for that box, okay? Now, just for an exercise, the last column, what I did is, based on farmers market prices from last year from the Rutherford and Knox County, the price of that CSA share box will be $633 if I was using prices, farmers markets prices, okay? But that's a good way to advertise that to your customers, because as I told you, this farm is selling the box for $26, and that will be a little bit higher if you were using farmers market prices. In general, this farm is actually offering this box for 22% below the prices the customer will be paying at the farmer's market, okay? So this is just an exercise of how will you set that base price, how will you establish your premiums, and as you might imagine, your price premiums are gonna be anywhere between your grocery store prices and your farmer's markets prices.
Megan, do you want to talk a little bit about the options for e-commerce for CSAs, since we're talking about pricing?
I can quickly. There is an excellent resource that is included in the URL at the bottom, and I can copy and paste that into the chat box for folks who are interested in this, that compares several different e-commerce options for direct farm marketers, including CSAs. There were 6 or 7 there, 7 listed that indicated that they would work for CSAs. CSA Weere, Farmigo, Grown by Harvest Hand, Harvey, Local Food Marketplace, and Local Line. And I think, Margarita, when you talked with several Tennessee CSAs, I believe you said that all the ones that you talked to that had an online presence were using Harvey. And
That is correct.
I'm not sure why I haven't delved deeply into each of these, but this publication provides some pretty good information on them. If you go to the next slide for me, thank you. This is an example of some of the information that the publication breaks down for each of the platforms listed. So it describes that Harvey is a comprehensive CSA management platform designed for member share customization with robust customer support. And it gives you the fees that are associated with the use of that. So they take 7% of your sales, and then they have a $500 setup fee, and then a transaction fee for using your credit card of 2.9% plus 30 cents for processing the credit card. So if you're interested in an online system for your CSA, I would recommend checking out this publication. The publication also talks about or has a link to some more, if you go to the next page, of some of the questions that you should ask before you decide on which software to use, or some of the topics that you need to look into. And that include the fee structure, how much it's going to cost to get set up, and then for each transaction that goes through there, how easy it is or difficult it is to set it up and to utilize the system over time, to update it and maintain it. The type of payment methods can be accepted through that. Is it only credit card, or can they check an option to pay you cash or check or something else directly at the farm? Also of interest to folks is how long it takes and when the farm will be paid. Once customers pay money into the system, how long does it take to get to you? The ease of the customer interface, is it easy to navigate? Will customers understand it and have a good experience in using that platform? Any special features you needed? For example, some of them will help you figure out delivery routes. Annette mentioned delivery as a service consideration this year. Pack lists or labels if you're using those types of things. So what features do you need, or could you really use in a software? Some of them offer some and some don't. The IT support available for some of us who may be a little less tech savvy. Some folks would be interested in the ability of the software to integrate either with their current website or with their accounting software. So that can certainly be beneficial if you're using other software. If your point of sale or your e-commerce software will integrate data seamlessly, that will save you some time and perhaps reduce some errors. And then data security, to making sure your customer data and their payment information is secure, but also to make sure how that data may be used by that company, or what happens to that data if you decide to leave this e-commerce platform. What happens with it? So those are just a few of the considerations when choosing a software. There is a link to these questions from the publication that I referenced before, and I will send an email to all the registered participants with the link to the recording and some of these links as well, and the fact sheet that we'll do as a follow-up to this, I believe. will be there as well.
Annette,
So
sorry.
on that site also, the Oregon Till researched a couple of these, including the Harvey example that we used, and tried to find answers to a lot of these topics and questions that folks should ask. So take a look at that page again for some additional information.
Right. Annette, I think John has a comment here on the chat, and he says, I guess I need to grow items of interest before I start to worry about pricing them. And you probably are correct. He's currently working towards a 1,500 foot high tunnel structure. So I'm wondering if it will be important to go through a couple of things related to what things to consider before you start jumping on that CSA of your ability to grow multiple crops, what logistics it will take. And so I'm wondering if that information might be useful to John.
That's a great point. Thanks, Margarita. Samantha, if you could go back to slide 16 for me. I put together a couple of slides about thinking of starting a CSA because I've heard a lot of folks saying that they want to start a CSA this year because different markets have been a little tenuous this year and they don't know if they can get into a farmer's market necessarily. Different municipalities have had different rules about farmers markets, and CSAs kind of take you out of being beholden to a different outfit to do your marketing, and you can kind of do it yourself. But Margarita's right. Before jumping into a CSA, there's several things you want to consider, because CSAs really take experience and a lot of coordination and organization and the cooperation of the weather, which is always an issue for any grower in any year, but particularly for CSAs when you're trying to get a variety of crops in a box in any given week over that 20 to 30 week period that Margarita talked about. The other thing about CSAs is they're really complex. So much of your CSA planning is going to take place on paper. And John, when you throw a high tunnel in there too, some folks might be used to growing in the field, and when you go to a high tunnel, we often say it's like growing on Mars because it's a totally different environment and things can grow faster and they can grow bigger, and you can have different issues than you have in the field with a high tunnel. And with the CSA, every single crop that you're going to grow in that CSA has a learning curve. So it's really important to really pencil everything out first, make sure you know what you're planning on in a box every week, and have a backup plan for that plan. So this is where things like storage crops can come in really handy. If you have garlic, or if you have potatoes or sweet potatoes or winter squash, those can be great to fill in boxes when they might be a little light. Other great things for CSAs are things like dry beans. So you can store them from one season to the other. And that's always a great thing too, when you can put a pound of beans in or whatever it is in that box in that given week. So we always say plant extra and then plant some more, because it seems like things can come up, insects can get into a planting, and so if you're constantly doing succession planting, you have enough to share with the insects and still get into your boxes. And for folks that haven't done a CSA before, I always recommend that they do a trial in a different sort of market first. So plan like you're having a CSA without taking people's money, because that's the other appealing thing about CSAs is you get that money on the front end, but your customers are really expecting that you have a high quality product and that you're going to fill that box every week. So I always suggest that people do a trial year where they pencil everything out and see how well that plan works, but then take it to a different market where nobody's expecting them to have 10 things in their box that week. And so if you're missing half of those things when it comes down to a particular week, people at the farmer's market don't know that. And you can get by, and then you can tweak that plan and figure out when you're really ready to jump into the CSA. Next slide, please, Samantha. So these are different questions to ask yourself, and this is taken mostly from University of California, Santa Cruz CSA planning. They also have an internship program there and run a CSA at their university. And the first question is, can you consistently provide a variety of crops? So you're going to want to aim for about 10 things in a box per week, and you need to maintain that over 20 to 30 weeks. So you want to think about what those 10 things are going to be every week. Keep in mind that people don't want peppers, lots and lots of peppers every week for many, many weeks. So you want to make sure that you're giving them that variety, but you are still providing staples that they expect. Things like lettuce, people always want to have their salad, so that's a good one that you can put in a box every week if you have it and can maintain it over the season. How many people can you accommodate? So that's another good place where you want to start smaller. It's always good if you have excess, you can always usually find another market for it. So you could go to a farmer's market or other outlet to get rid of excess produce. But if you don't have enough, that's really problematic. So aim low there and aim low on your number of people and high on the amount of crop that you're going to harvest. And then do you have, which I already talked about, a good mix of storage crops to add to boxes when things are light? How much of each crop do you need to harvest? And how often? So this is not going to only help with your planning, but also with how much labor you might need. Can you do this all yourself, or do you need to hire a few people? And then what kind of quantity? Is it going to be pounds or bunches or heads of the produce is intended for each share? And again, what's that frequency of harvest? So is it something like a head of lettuce that you're going to go out and harvest the morning of the share pickup? Or is it going to be bunches of beets that you're going to pre-bunch, and how often are you going to have something like that? What's the total number of plants that you are required each week to supply the produce? So is it something like a tomato where you might get 20 pounds off of one tomato plant versus you need to have each individual lettuce head there for each member of your share if you're putting a head of lettuce in that box? So that helps in calculating your number of plants. And then what number of plants do you need for the whole season to supply an amount of produce at that frequency? So these are all really good questions to work through. And you want to think about labor intensive crops. So I know lots of growers that say they are only going to grow one labor intensive crop per season because they just can't manage having both something like snap beans that are very labor intensive and cherry tomatoes at once. So they go for one or the other to help manage that labor, and other kind of tips like that that'll help you balance what goes in that box and how much you're going to put in. So lots of moving parts, and some things you're going to need to plant every 2 weeks, something like lettuce. If you want to offer that in a share every week, it's going to be continuously planted. For us, our CSA is organic, so we plant a lot of cucurbits because we do get a lot of insects or cucumber beetles and squash bugs and things that like to get into the cucurbits, and we know that we're just going to have to keep having succession plantings to keep those cucurbits going throughout the season. Any other questions that have come up while we're talking? John put in the chat, plan your work, work your plan, and that's exactly right, especially with the CSA. All right, well, we appreciate you spending your evening with us. If any other questions come up as you get going into the season, or things we might not have covered here tonight and you didn't want to ask today, but they might come up tomorrow morning when you wake up and you'll think, oh, I wish I asked that, please let us know. We do have 2 resource pages. We have the UT Vegetable Production site, and that has the resources on masks and has some glove things, as well as the pickup information that we talked about here tonight, and other good resources on there for just general farm production. And then the Center for Profitable Agriculture also has an excellent COVID-19 resource page with lots of webinars and lots of other good resources as well.
We have a
So,
question on the chat about, are we going to have a webinar on COVID-19 and farmers markets and roadside stands? And I'll let Megan maybe handle that.
That's a good question. We have a group that is exploring whether or not, one, for farmers markets, it would be needed. The Farmers Market Association has been leading some calls and among farmers markets in the state. So they were trying to figure out whether a session would be needed or not. We do have one that is just now been scheduled for next Thursday night on e-commerce platforms, and information about that will be going out tomorrow and actually tonight on the Center for Profitable Agriculture Facebook page. But we will be exploring whether there are needs for other topics. So if you have a need, I'd invite you to email me. I'll put my email message in the chat, and particularly topics and questions that you may have that we may be able to address in another session for others, or for you if we determine that there may not be enough need to do a session, or be able to point you to some other existing resources. Oops.
well, again, thank you all for joining us this evening. And please don't hesitate to reach out to one of us if more questions come up after you get going into your season. So thanks again.